Do you want to improve the quality of your dark mode design, but you're not sure where to start? Crafting the perfect dark interface involved a lot more than you might first think. And it's not as simple as just inverting your current color palette. Let me tell you a story. When dark UI first started gaining popularity, I jumped in straight away to give it a try. But something just fell off. My designs didn't feel quite right. I later discovered that you need to think differently when designing dark interfaces. To create and build a realistic feeling of depth, we have to think about how we perceive light sources in the real world and follow a consistent approach to layering and hierarchy. Once I discovered this, I could unlock the true aesthetic that made the dark UI movement so effective. I'm going to share everything I've learned with you now so that you can avoid the same mistakes that I made and elevate your UI design skills fast. So we're going to take 2 examples and look at how we can go from light to dark in a few simple steps. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our base color palette. So a good technique is to always start with your brand color. So in this case, we've got this blue purple that we're going to start with, and this is going to inform the basis of the different shades that we're going to use to build up our layers of dark UI. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this swatch, and I'm going to talk about a technique that I tend to use, which is quite effective. Now, if we want to darken this blue, you could effectively just draw this down towards the black on this color swatch. But what that does is that the saturation doesn't change with that brightness level. So in order to retain a very similar blue, but on a darker scale, what we tend to do is to follow a curvature down towards the corner, almost getting into the black, but not quite. And we'll stop there at like 4 on the lightness scale. And what that's given us is a darker shade, which we can use for the background of our dark UI, but it still retains a hint of that original brand color, so we can have that cohesive, consistent feel. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create 4 or 5 different shades. So we would take now the darkest shade that we have, go into our selector, and just begin to gradually move through. So this time we're moving up and to the left until we get a lighter shade. It's still keeping that blue tint. Repeat the process until we have our 5 different shades that we can then use to build up the structure of our UI, which is going to give us enough scope to build the different layers when it comes to our UI. When it comes to using color against the dark UI, we need to be sure that things aren't too saturated. Now, this brand color would be just fine to use as accents, primary CTAs, or links when it comes to a light background, but against a darker UI, it's going to be too saturated. So what we can do is we can just drop that saturation level down, and you'll see there that it's a very similar color, just without that saturation, and that's going to make a huge difference when it comes to laying that against a dark background. We have our brand color, we have our 5 different levels of gray to build up the structure of our UI, and now all that's left is to create colors for our text. Because we're not using black as the background, you can't actually get away with using a white for the text. However, I often prefer just to drop it down a little bit to an off-white. So we'll go for 98 lightness for the primary text color, and then we're going for around 91, 92 for that secondary text color. And this gives us enough to work with for now. It may seem basic, but the key here is to build up each layer at a time and then only add color where truly necessary. Now we have our color palette ready, we're going to take this first example UI and start to build up depth using those different shades of gray and apply them to this interface. So you'll see here that we're actually using a border to distinguish between the content and the background. So borders are still really effective when it comes to dark UI. But let's start by removing it and just seeing how far we can get just using different shades for the backgrounds. So we'll start with the outer background, and we'll always use the darkest shade in this case. So one thing to remember is that when we're thinking about the natural light and how that casts on us in the real world, you tend to find that things that are further away seem darker, and things that are closer to you tend to be lighter. So we're going to use this concept and apply it to our interface using these different shades. So for the darkest, that is applied to the So now we have our color palette ready. We're going to take the first example UI and apply those to create our dark interface. So you'll see here that we use a border to separate the foreground from the background. Now while we can still use borders in a dark interface, we're going to start with the basics, and we're just going to use background color alone to distinguish between the different levels of content. If we think about the way that natural light is cast and how we perceive the depth of things around us based on the level of light, we can start to think about, well, things that are further away from us tend to appear darker, while things that are closer to us typically are on the lighter side. So we can use this concept and apply that directly to this interface to build up a level of structure. So what we can do is we can take our main background and apply the darkest gray that we have to that. From here, we can start to build up based on these different levels. So we're going to remove this border, begin with, and then for the next level up, we're going to apply this gray for the main content. And then we can see we have this call out here. So in the original design, this was in fact a darker gray against the white background, but we're going to go the opposite way this time. And we're going to choose a lighter gray. So we're going to go the next level up for this CTA call out. And we can see that the block quote has a light gray border. So we can then use a lighter shade. Perhaps we might go to the lightest level for that. So we've not looked at the text color just yet, but even by applying these different background colors, we've started to build this level of depth. And of course, you can see that there's that blue tint there, which is aligning with the brand color. So the next thing we're going to do is bring out the text. Use the lightest primary color for headings and anything that needs to be prominent in terms of the text. And then the secondary color is typically used for large quantities of text. So for the body text, we'll probably use that secondary color there, so it's not too vivid. We take the headings, give it that primary color, and we'll go with the body, and I think we'll go with this secondary text here, secondary color, and bring out the block quote there with the primary as well. So we can see here that we've got a good level of contrast. One thing you should be mindful of when designing, especially with dark UI, is the level of accessibility. So we can run a quick test here. If you don't already use it, I recommend checking out the Stark plugin for Figma. And this is a really easy way to test out the color contrast, particularly with text, against your designs. So we can see there that white is great in terms of the contrast level. The secondary is good too. And once you're running Stark, you can switch between the contrast models. So we've got WCAG 2.1, which is probably more familiar to most people. And we do have APCA, which is more of a recent standard, which is geared towards text specifically. So it's a great one to use when checking your contrast levels. Okay, so we're happy with that. I think that's a good starting point. And of course, for the CTA, we're going to drop that saturation down by using that updated brand color. And you can see there that it's much more subtle and definitely more legible and clear. Dark interfaces can actually reduce the level of energy used by people's displays. This is because they don't need to render as many bright pixels as they typically would. Now, this alone shouldn't be the reason to opt for a dark mode UI, but it's a small added benefit if you do. Remember, it's always useful to put in the research to find out if a dark interface is actually valuable to your target audience and for the type of product that you are designing. For this second example interface, we're going to go a little bit further, and we're going to talk about borders and shadows, and when you might want to use them, and when they don't make as much sense. Now, we'll see here with this light version of the UI, we do have the container within a border, and we do have a shadow applied there. A very subtle shadow, but it does add that extra feeling of depth, which works well for a light UI. This isn't always the case when it comes to dark interfaces, because shadows are much harder to see against a darker background, which is why we use different shades of grey to build up that hierarchy instead. The use of borders can still be very effective in dark interfaces, however. So let's check out how we can use those. So we'll start to build up our structure using the different shades of grey. Okay, so a good start. We've got the main background, we've got the foreground here using a lighter shade. We do have the border still applied. So what we can do here is we can choose one of the lighter shades of grey for that border. Now the border tends to be a lot more subtle in this case, but it does add that little bit of subtle break between the backgrounds that really helps bring the content to center stage. From here, we'll apply the text colors using a very similar approach with the primary and secondary. And we will desaturate that button as we've done in the past. Now, in terms of inputs and buttons, for the primary CTA, this brand color works well because there's enough contrast between the button color and the background it sits on, but it's not too harsh of a contrast. Whereas you'll see with these inputs here and these secondary buttons, the white just doesn't work too well against that darker background. So for this, we can apply a very similar approach to how we've been building up the depth up until now. So we can try out one of the lighter grays for the input. And again, we can use the stroke as we normally would. So this works because the input is now that lighter shade of gray compared to the background that it sits on. So immediately that tells people that it's a separate element entirely, and there could be an interactive element to that. And we can apply the same effect to these secondary buttons. I think we're going to lighten that text. Just use the primary text color for those. And already you can see here that we've created these levels of depth just by using different background colors and a couple of borders. And not only that, the interactive elements are very clear and legible. Give these techniques a try on your next project to really elevate the quality of your designs. Don't forget to like this video and consider subscribing for more tips and tricks to really level up your design skills.